Whimsy permitted himself the luxury of a single raised eyebrow, a gesture which he had long ago perfected to communicate simultaneously the utmost skepticism and the most profound courtesy. He bent to examine the severed gooseberry, with the concentration one might ordinarily reserve for an illuminated manuscript or a particularly challenging crossword puzzle, though the attention was rather wasted upon so humble an object. The cut, upon closer inspection, was indeed remarkably clean, the work of something far sharper than an ordinary kitchen knife, and executed with a steadiness that suggested either considerable manual dexterity or a mechanical implement of some precision. The flesh of the fruit had begun to discolor at the exposed surfaces, turning a faint brownish hue that indicated the operation had transpired perhaps 2 to 3 hours prior, though such estimates were notoriously unreliable in matters botanical. Whimsy straightened, his expression settling into one of mild amusement. "Mrs. Weatherby," he observed, "you have not yet explained the central catastrophe that prompted your telegram. And I confess myself increasingly curious regarding the relationship between bisected gooseberries and whatever circumstance has necessitated my journey to this bucolic venue. Might we perhaps retire to a sitting room of some description, where you might compose yourself and relate the full particulars of the something beastly in question? I suspect that the gooseberry, while undoubtedly the work of someone possessed of either considerable eccentricity or considerable hostility, is perhaps not itself the primary matter at hand." Muriel nodded with evident relief, as though grateful to have her narrative burden temporarily lifted and redirected towards someone possessed of sufficient fortitude to bear it. The drawing-room proved to be decorated in that particular style, which one might charitably describe as late Victorian sentiment, struggling against mid-20th century practicality, a battleground between antimacassars and contemporary furniture, between oil paintings of ecclesiastical subjects and modern electric lamps of aggressive functionality. Whimsy settled himself into a wing-back chair with the air of a man accustomed to subjecting himself to inferior upholstery in the service of investigation, while Bunter accepted a position near the doorway, with that unobtrusiveness which had endeared him to countless witnesses over the years, his presence neither threatening nor entirely negligible. Muriel seated herself upon the edge of a settee and clasped her hands together in that manner which suggested she was gathering the fragments of her composure prior to distributing them into narrative sequence. "It is my brother-in-law," she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone entirely unjustified by the circumstances, as there seemed to be no one within earshot to overhear her. "That is to say, he is the brother-in-law of my late husband, so technically he is my brother-in-law only in the most attenuated sense, though he has lived in this village these past 30 years, and everyone refers to him as such. His name is Mr. Raymond Ashford, an entirely unremarkable man by temperament, though distinguished by a certain obstinacy regarding his personal habits and his conviction that the parish church is in dire need of restoration, a matter which has occupied his attention for nearly 2 decades. He was discovered dead in his study this morning, Lord Peter. Dead, and arranged in a most extraordinary manner." Whimsy's interest, which had been hovering at the level of polite attention, underwent a rather marked acceleration. "Arranged?" he inquired, his tone suggesting that Mrs. Weatherby had employed a term whose implications required immediate elucidation. "You do not mean to suggest that the unfortunate Mr. Ashford was merely discovered in his study, but rather that he was positioned with deliberate intention?" Muriel nodded with the fervor of one whose worst suspicions have been vindicated by inquiry. "Precisely so," she confirmed. "He was seated in his desk chair, entirely dressed in his evening attire, which is itself peculiar, as he has not attended any social engagement in years, and upon the desk before him was arranged a collection of objects that the police seem to regard as entirely inconsequential, but which strike me as laden with the most sinister significance. There were 3 items placed in a perfect line: a fountain pen, a seal depicting the crest of the parish church, and a gooseberry. Yes, a gooseberry, Lord Peter, precisely identical to the one now residing upon the hall table. And there was a note, you see, or at least there was something that might have been a note, though the police inspector insisted it was merely a sketch or perhaps the preliminary stage of a letter. It consisted of nothing more than a series of mathematical symbols arranged in a pattern that made no sense whatsoever. Whimsy's expression had assumed that peculiar quality of concentration which suggested that his mind had begun performing calculations that his mouth was not yet prepared to articulate. "These objects," he said slowly, "they were placed with geometric precision, I presume? Not haphazardly arranged?" Muriel confirmed this with renewed emphasis, and Whimsy rose from his chair with the abruptness of one seized by a sudden inspiration. "Mrs. Weatherby, I should very much like to examine Mr. Ashford's study immediately, and thereafter I shall require interviews with anyone who might have possessed knowledge of his movements yesterday. But first, I wonder if you might provide me with the name of the local police inspector, as it will be necessary to establish whether he possesses the intellectual flexibility required to tolerate my involvement in what I suspect may prove to be a considerably more complex matter than any simple accident or even straightforward murder. The gooseberries suggest otherwise, and gooseberries, I assure you, are rarely employed in criminal enterprise without considerable forethought. The study of the late Raymond Ashford presented itself as a tableau of considerable precision, the sort of room that spoke to habits of meticulous order, and perhaps an excess of time devoted to the contemplation of one's own importance. Inspector Graves, a stolid man of perhaps 50 years with the bearing of someone who had spent his entire career in small villages and had consequently developed an immunity to surprise, stood near the window with the air of one attending a social obligation, rather than investigating a death. He was not, Whimsy observed immediately, a man possessed of imaginative faculty, which meant he was precisely the sort of inspector with whom one could cooperate most successfully, provided one was willing to translate one's more elaborate deductions into the sort of straightforward language that bypassed the necessity of actual reasoning. The body had been removed, for which Whimsy was grateful, as corpses had a tendency to complicate the forensic landscape through the sheer visual insistence of their presence. What remained was the scene itself, the desk, the chair, the objects arranged upon its surface in that peculiar line of which Mrs. Weatherby had spoken. Whimsy approached the arrangement with the deliberation of an art historian confronting an abstract composition, his hands clasped behind his back in that manner which suggested he was physically restraining the pen from touching anything that might constitute evidence. The fountain pen was a Waterman of superior quality, the sort that one did not purchase without considerable deliberation or considerable resources. The seal was indeed rendered with the heraldic particularity of ecclesiastical symbolism. The parish church, rendered in miniature with what could only have been professional craftsmanship, and the gooseberry, now somewhat further desiccated than its counterpart in the hall, was positioned with mathematical exactitude between the two objects, its bisected surface facing directly toward the chair wherein the body had been discovered. "Inspector," Whimsy said, without shifting his gaze from the arrangement, "I wonder if you might indulge my curiosity regarding the positioning of the body itself. Was Mr. Ashford discovered facing the desk, or was his position somehow more unusual?" Graves consulted a notebook that bore the air of having been composed with considerable effort and minimal inspiration. "He was sitting quite normally, my lord, facing the desk as one would if one were about to write something or attend to correspondence. His hands were folded upon the desk surface, one upon the other. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of violence whatsoever. The doctor is of the opinion that he suffered a cardiac episode. He was not a young man, after all, and his heart might have simply given out. The arrangement of objects and the note are precisely the sort of peculiarity one finds in the chambers of elderly men who possess too much time and insufficient purpose." Whimsy allowed himself a thin smile, the sort that suggested he was observing a joke that no one else in the room had yet perceived as humorous. "The note," he said, turning to regard the inspector with renewed interest. "You mentioned mathematical symbols. Might you describe them with greater precision? And, more importantly, might I inquire whether they resembled any particular system of notation, algebraic, perhaps, or something more esoteric?" Graves fumbled with his notebook, his expression suggesting that he regretted having mentioned the matter at all. The symbols, when described, appeared to be a simple sequence, a circle, a square, a triangle, arranged in descending order upon the page, with what appeared to be a mathematical equal sign drawn beneath them. Whimsy's interest crystallized into something more focused and considerably more intent. "Inspector, I should very much like to examine the study more comprehensively. Specifically, I wonder if you might permit me to inspect the bookshelves, the contents of the desk drawers, and any correspondence that Mr. Ashford might have been engaged in prior to his demise. Furthermore, I should like to know the precise time at which the body was discovered, who discovered it, and whether anyone had observed Mr. Ashford during the evening preceding his death." Graves seemed to regard this request with the resignation of one who understood that Whimsy's presence, while occasionally useful, was invariably accompanied by demands that exceeded the bounds of conventional police procedure. Nevertheless, he cooperated, directing a constable to provide such access as was necessary. Whimsy began with the bookshelves, his fingers trailing across the spines with the concentration of a bibliophile confronting a personal library of considerable worth. The collection was eclectic. Theological works predominated, particularly volumes devoted to ecclesiastical architecture and the restoration of medieval churches, but there were also texts on mathematics, geometry, and what appeared to be an entire section devoted to cryptography and codes. One volume in particular caught Whimsy's attention, a 19th-century treatise on symbolic geom. Etri and its application to esoteric philosophy, its margins annotated extensively in what was presumably Ashford's hand. He extracted it carefully and opened to a page marked with a ribbon, whereupon he discovered a passage underlined with considerable force, the fundamental symbols of creation, the circle representing eternity, the square representing the material world, the triangle representing divine aspiration, when combined in proper sequence, reveal the hidden language through which man might commune with the eternal. Whimsy closed the volume and turned to regard the inspector with an expression of profound amusement. "Inspector Graves," he observed, "I believe we have been laboring under a misapprehension regarding the nature of Mr. Ashford's demise. This was not, I suspect, a cardiac episode at all, nor was it an accident. Moreover, I begin to suspect that whoever arranged Mr. Ashford's body with such theatrical precision and left behind these cryptic symbols was not attempting to conceal a crime, but rather to communicate something of considerable importance, a message directed, perhaps, not at the constabulary, but at someone specific within this village. I shall require interviews with Mr. Ashford's household staff, his family members, and any acquaintances who might have visited him recently. And I should very much like to know whether anyone in Ashford in the Weald possesses expertise in the restoration of medieval churches. The servants' quarters at Ashford House were situated in that netherworld of domestic architecture, wherein the comfort and convenience of the family gave way to the austere practicality demanded by service, a transition marked by a narrow doorway and a perceptible drop in both temperature and atmospheric amenity. It was here that Whimsy discovered Miss Eleanor Hartley, Mr. Ashford's housekeeper of 23 years, a woman whose fac bore the particular expression of one who had devoted the whole of her adult life to the maintenance of another person's household and had consequently developed an immunity to surprise that bordered upon the monumental. She sat ramrod straight in a chair that appeared deliberately uncomfortable, her hands folded upon her lap, with the precision of someone accustomed to occupying space without drawing attention to herself. "Miss Hartley," Whimsy began, settling himself into an equally uninviting chair with the grace of one accustomed to extracting information from the reluctant. "I understand that you discovered Mr. Ashford's body this morning. Might you describe the precise circumstances of that discovery?" Miss Hartley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign that the inquiry had registered upon her consciousness. "I brought his tea at 7:30, she said, her voice carrying the flat inflection of someone reciting established fact. "As I have done every morning for 23 years. I knocked upon the study door. I always knock, it is proper to knock, and when there was no response, I entered. He was sitting at his desk, quite still. I believed at first that he had fallen asleep, which was not uncommon in his later years, but when I approached more closely, I perceived that his skin possessed an unusual pallor. I dispatched the younger housemaid to fetch the doctor immediately. Whimsy leaned forward slightly, his expression suggesting that her account, while satisfactory, had not yet exhausted his curiosity. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, was Mr. Ashford in the habit of retiring to his study in the evening, and more particularly was he accustomed to dressing in evening attire for purposes of remaining at home?" A slight hesitation crossed Miss Hartley's features, the merest flutter of what might have been recognition or recollection. "He had ken to doing so in recent months," she admitted, her tone suggesting that she regarded this habit as eccentric, but not sufficiently remarkable to comment upon. Perhaps 3 times weekly, he would request that I press his evening clothes, and he would retire to the study after dinner dressed quite formally. I assumed he was attending to business of importance, though he never mentioned where he was going, or if he was going anywhere at all. This revelation seemed to confirm something that Whimsy had begun to suspect, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. And on the evening preceding his death, last evening that is, did he request that his evening attire be prepared? Miss Hartley nodded, and Whimsy rose from his chair with the suddenness of one seized by an inspiration that could not be deferred. "Bunter," he said, addressing his associate who had been standing near the doorway with that discretion which suggested he was observing far more than his posture indicated, "I should very much like you to make a thorough examination of Mr. Ashford's wardrobe, particularly any garments that he has worn within the past 6 months. I am searching for anything that might suggest he was engaged in activities requiring specialized dress. Paint stains, perhaps, or marks that might indicate manual labor of some description. Miss Hartley, I wonder if you might provide Mr. Bunter with access to Mr. Ashford's bedchamber and dressing room." It was as Miss Hartley was leading Bunter away that Whimsy turned his attention to a question that had been forming itself in his mind since the examination of the study. "One final matter, Miss Hartley. During the time you have been in service at this house, has Mr. Ashford received any visitors of particular note? Anyone who might be described as a regular caller, or anyone whose visits seemed to generate anxiety or unusual activity?" Miss Hartley paused at the threshold, her hand upon the doorframe, and for a moment Whimsy perceived something cross her face, a flicker of knowledge that she had not previously volunteered. "There was a gentleman," she said slowly, "who began calling approximately 18 months ago. He came fortnightly, always in the evening, and always through the garden entrance rather than the front door. Mr. Ashford was quite specific about that arrangement. I never learned his name. He was a scholarly-looking man, perhaps somewhat younger than Mr. Ashford, with the bearing of someone accustomed to academic pursuits. They would lock themselves in the study for several hours, and I could hear them discussing matters of considerable intensity, though whether they were arguing or merely engaged in passionate discussion, I could not determine." Whimsy's eyebrows rose fractionally, an indication that this intelligence had struck him as being of more than trivial consequence. "And when was this gentleman last observed visiting the residence?" he inquired, his tone suggesting that the answer was now a matter of considerable urgency. Miss Hartley's face became even more drawn, if such a thing were possible. 3 days ago, my lord, on Tuesday evening. He came through the garden as always, and he and Mr. Ashford remained in the study until nearly midnight. I remember because I was required to remain awake to ensure the house was properly secured, and I heard them raised in what I can only describe as a heated altercation. There was shouting, actual shouting, which in all my years I had never heard from Mr. Ashford. The gentleman left in considerable agitation, and Mr. Ashford seemed quite disturbed for the remainder of the evening." Whimsy absorbed this information with the air of a man adding another piece to a puzzle that was only now beginning to suggest its ultimate configuration. D.I. This gentleman bear any distinguishing characteristics? Accent, mannerism, physical peculiarity? Miss Hartley considered this query with the seriousness it merited. He had a curious habit of referring to classical mythology during moments of agitation, she said. I recall him saying something about Prometheus and his terrible gift as he departed. It struck me as an odd turn of phrase for someone in such evident distress. Whimsy descended the narrow servants' staircase with the deliberation of a man whose mind was engaged in matters considerably more pressing than the immediate geography of the house. though his footfalls remained measured and his outward demeanor betrayed no indication of the acceleration that had occurred within his intellectual processes. The reference to Prometheus was not, he reflected, the sort of allusion that one might expect from a casual visitor to a provincial village, nor was it the language of an individual engaged in straightforward theft or personal vendetta. It suggested, rather, a mind of some cultivation, the sort that trafficked in classical learning and perhaps in the sort of esoteric symbolism that he had observed, annotated so extensively in the margins of Ashford's cryptographical treatise. The combination of elements, the mathematical symbols, the ecclesiastical seal, the bisected gooseberries, and now the revelation of a mysterious scholar, engaged in what appeared to be a relationship of both intellectual intimacy and considerable tension, was beginning to suggest a narrative considerably more elaborate than any simple murder prompted by conventional motive. When Whimsy reached the ground floor, he found Inspector Graves in consultation with a young constable near the study entrance. The two men engaged in the sort of murmured discussion that suggested they were attempting to arrive at conclusions that the evidence did not adequately support. Graves looked up at Whimsy's approach with an expression that mingled hope and resignation in roughly equal measure. "My lord," he ventured, "we have been able to ascertain that no one entered the study through any window or external access point. The locks upon the study door were engaged from within when the body was discovered, and Miss Hartley had to employ her master key to gain entrance. The doctor maintains his conviction that death resulted from cardiac failure, though he concedes there was no obvious physical trauma." "Inspector," Whimsy replied, settling himself into a wing-back chair with the air of one prepared for a conversation of some length, "I wonder if your physician examined the contents of Mr. Ashford's stomach, or if he observed anything of interest regarding the arrangement of objects upon the desk immediately prior to removing the body." Graves consulted his notes, his frown deepening as he did so. "There was nothing recorded regarding that particular matter, my lord. The doctor examined the body in situ and pronounced death to have occurred within a window of 6 to 12 hours preceding discovery. As for the objects, they were catalogued by the constable on duty, but no particular significance was attached to their arrangement." Whimsy rose from his chair and returned to the study, his pace quickening now with the purposefulness of a man who had begun to perceive the outline of a solution that was as yet incomplete, but no longer entirely opaque. He approached the desk and examined the precise location where each object had been positioned, his fingers hovering above the surface without making contact. "Tell me, Inspector, was Mr. Ashford left-handed or right-handed?" Graves seemed momentarily nonplussed by this inquiry, but he consulted his notes once more. "According to Miss Hartley, he was decidedly right-handed, always H. had been. She mentioned it specifically when describing how he conducted his correspondence." Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this confirmation had resolved a question that had been troubling him. "Observe," he said, gesturing toward the desk, "the position of the objects. The fountain pen lies to the left of the mathematical symbols, and the ecclesiastical seal lies to the right, with the gooseberry positioned between them in perfect alignment. This arrangement suggests not the work of someone placing objects upon a desk after the fact, but rather the careful positioning of items that were already present in some form prior to Mr. Ashford's death. More intriguingly, the mathematical symbols themselves appear to have been rendered with considerable deliberation. The lines are bold, the forms distinct. Yet we have found no evidence of a writing implement near the body, nor have we discovered the paper upon which these symbols were drawn. You are suggesting, my lord, that someone entered the study and arranged these objects after Mr. Ashford was deceased." Graves's tone indicated that he found this hypothesis considerably more troubling than the notion of cardiac failure. "I am suggesting something considerably more complex than that, Inspector. I am suggesting that these objects and their arrangement tell a story that Mr. Ashford's mysterious visitor was endeavoring to communicate through the medium of a tableau. The mathematical symbols, the ecclesiastical seal, the precise positioning of objects that all relate to matters of some significance to both parties. This is not the work of someone engaged in common murder. This is the work of someone engaged in a form of communication, and the fact that it has been staged with such theatrical precision suggests that the message was not directed at those who would investigate the death, but rather at someone else. NT. Rely. Someone who would recognize the significance of what had been arranged and understand its meaning. Whimsy moved toward the bookshelves and extracted the cryptographical treatise once more, opening it to the passage concerning symbolic geometry. "These symbols that the constable recorded," he said, holding the book toward the light, "they represent not mathematical notation at all, but rather the fundamental language of a particular esoteric system. The circle, the square, the triangle, they correspond not to equations but to philosophical concepts, and their arrangement in descending order might suggest a progression from the abstract toward the concrete, or from the eternal toward the temporal. If my hypothesis is correct, then someone has left behind not merely a message about Mr. Ashford's death, but a confession of motive and a declaration of philosophical justification for what has occurred." Inspector Graves's expression had assumed the particular quality of an individual who was beginning to suspect that he had gravely underestimated the complexity of the case before him. "But, my lord," he said slowly, "if what you suggest is true, then we must identify this mysterious visitor and understand what grievance or philosophical dispute might have driven him to such an elaborate murder. We must also determine how Mr. Ashford was killed if the doctor can detect no obvious cause of death." Whimsy smiled then, an expression of genuine satisfaction mingled with something darker, the satisfaction of a man who has begun to perceive not merely the shape of the crime, but the psychology of the criminal. "That, Inspector," he said, "is precisely what we shall endeavor to discover. But first, I believe it would be most profitable to examine Mr. Ashford's correspondence and his financial records. I suspect we shall find evidence of a considerable donation to the parish church, perhaps more than one, and we shall also, I imagine, discover some indication of why such donations were being made and what they were intended to accomplish. The financial records of Raymond Ashford, when extracted from a leather portfolio secreted within the study's desk, revealed a narrative of considerable generosity, coupled with what might charitably be described as obsessive dedication to a singular cause. Over the course of the past 18 months, precisely the period during which the mysterious scholar had begun his fortnightly visits, Ashford had transferred no fewer than 7 substantial sums to the parish church restoration fund, each donation accompanied by a specification regarding its intended application. The amounts themselves were not insignificant, £500 here, £300 there, with a final extraordinary contribution of £2,000 dated merely 3 weeks prior. Whimsy examined these records with the care of an accountant auditing the ledgers of a major commercial enterprise, his finger tracing the dates and amounts with methodical precision. "Inspector," he observed, without lifting his gaze from the documents, "I wonder if you might ascertain the precise purposes to which these donations were intended. Specifically, I should like to know whether they relate to the restoration of a particular architectural feature or whether they represent a general contribution to the overall renovation scheme." Graves departed to make inquiries, and Whimsy turned his attention to the correspondence, which proved to be equally illuminating in its own peculiar fashion. The letters were few in number. Ashford was apparently not a man given to extensive epistolary exchange, but those that remained spoke to a relationship of considerable intellectual engagement, coupled with mounting anxiety. One letter in particular, dated some 6 weeks prior, and written in an elegant but agitated hand, contained a passage that seemed to encapsulate the nature of their dispute. "You cannot continue in this manner, Raymond. The knowledge you have acquired carries obligations that you cannot simply purchase away through the mechanism of financial contribution. What you have done, what you have allowed to be done, demands more than renovated stonework and ecclesiastical grandeur. It demands acknowledgement, confession, and the willingness to face the consequences of your own complicity in an injustice that has festered for decades. I urge you in the strongest possible terms to reconsider your current course of action. The letter was unsigned, which suggested that Ashford had received it from his mysterious visitor in person rather than through conventional postal channels. Whimsy set it aside carefully and examined the remaining documents, discovering among them a journal, a leather-bound volume in which Ashford had apparently recorded his thoughts and observations with varying degrees of coherence. The entries became increasingly fragmented as the dates progressed, suggesting either a decline in mental acuity or the accumulation of anxiety that had rendered sustained composition increasingly difficult. One passage, dated approximately 1 month prior, read, "He has given me an ultimatum. Either I must publicly acknowledge what occurred and accept responsibility for my silence, or he will ensure that the truth emerges in a manner far more damaging to the reputation of the parish and the church itself. He speaks of justice and moral obligation, but what he truly seeks is vengeance for a crime that was not of my making, though I confess my complicity in its concealment. The weight of these 30 years has become insufferable. I fear I am not strong enough to bear what he demands of me." The final entry, dated the evening of Ashford's death, consisted of merely a single sentence. He comes tonight with his final demand. I have resolved to accept whatever consequences must follow. Whimsy closed the journal and sat back in Ashford's chair, the very chair in which the man had spent his final moments, permitting himself a moment of contemplative silence. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to assemble themselves into a configuration that suggested not a crime of passion or simple greed, but rather something far more philosophically complex, a murder that was simultaneously an act of vengeance, a moral imperative, and a form of communication directed at the conscience of an entire community. The mysterious scholar was not a murderer in the conventional sense, but rather an agent of retribution, someone who had been motivated by an injustice of sufficient magnitude that it had consumed his intellectual and emotional resources for what was presumably an extended period. The mathematical symbols, the ecclesiastical seal, the bisected gooseberries, these were not random elements, but rather carefully chosen components of a message, each one possessing significance that only those who understood the underlying grievance would fully comprehend. Bunter reappeared at that moment, bearing news that seemed to confirm the trajectory of Whimsy's reasoning. "My lord," he reported with characteristic understatement, "I have discovered within Mr. Ashford's wardrobe a suit of clothes bearing traces of paint and stone dust, consistent with the material employed in ecclesiastical restoration work. Moreover, in a locked cabinet within the dressing room, I have located a series of architectural drawings and sketches, apparently rendered by Mr. Ashford himself, detailing modifications to the structure of the parish church. The drawings are dated across a period of some 30 years, suggesting that Mr. Ashford possessed considerably more than a casual interest in the building's renovation and maintenance. Architectural drawings by an amateur enthusiast," Whimsy mused aloud, "or something more deliberate. Bunter, did you observe any particular focus within these sketches? Any area of the church that received repeated attention?" Bunter consulted a small notebook in which he had apparently recorded his observations. "There appears to be considerable emphasis upon the area beneath the chancel, my lord. The drawings suggest repeated modifications to the floor structure and the supporting masonry in that region. In fact, if I may be permitted an observation, the modifications seem designed to ensure that access to whatever lies beneath that location would be rendered permanently inaccessible." Whimsy rose from his chair with sudden purpose, his expression assuming that quality of focused intensity that suggested he had perceived the outline of the truth and was now engaged in assembling its final components. "Inspector Graves," he said, as that individual reappeared in the study, "I should very much like to visit the parish church this evening. More specifically, I should like to examine the chancel area with considerable care. And I should like you to make inquiries regarding any significant incidents that may have occurred at the church or within the parish approximately 30 years ago. Anything that might suggest an injustice substantial enough to motivate decades of concealment and ultimately inspire a murder orchestrated as an act of philosophical retribution." The parish church of St. Cuthbert's presented itself in the gathering twilight as a structure of considerable antiquity and modest grandeur, its Norman tower rendered almost spectral by the fading light and the gathering mist that had begun to rise from the village green. Whimsy approached it with the contemplative bearing of a man entering a space freighted with significance he had not yet entirely decoded, though the components of that significance were beginning to cohere into something approximating a coherent narrative. The vicar, the Reverend Thomas Blackwell, was a man of perhaps 70 years, possessed of that particular ecclesiastical demeanor which suggested he had spent his entire life managing the spiritual anxieties of others while maintaining a careful distance from his own. He received Whimsy's request to examine the chancel with an expression of puzzlement, mingled with a certain defensiveness that suggested the request itself had struck some nerve he would have preferred to leave undisturbed. "I confess myself somewhat bewildered by your interest in the architectural particulars of our humble parish church, Lord Peter," Blackwell ventured, his tone suggesting that he was attempting to establish the boundaries of what might be acceptably discussed without venturing into territory that remained profoundly uncomfortable. Whimsy offered him a smile of such studied innocence that it bordered on the insulting. "My dear Reverend, I am merely a student of ecclesiastical architecture with a particular weakness for Norman construction and the manner in which medieval buildings have been modified and adapted throughout the centuries. Surely you have no objection to permitting a simple examination of your chancel floor and the structural supports beneath it? Inspector Graves has informed me that the church has undergone considerable restoration in recent years, Mr. Ashford being one of its principal benefactors, I understand, and I confess myself curious regarding the nature of those renovations." Blackwell's resistance crumbled with the inevitability of poorly constructed masonry when subjected to sufficient pressure, and within moments Whimsy found himself in the chancel, lantern in hand, examining the floor with the meticulous attention of an archaeologist confronted with a site of potential historical significance. The stone was original to the medieval period. That much was evident from the wear patterns and the particular quality of the material. But it had been deliberately modified, the modifications themselves rendered invisible through the artful application of grouting and staining that had been executed with considerable skill. Whimsy ran his fingers across the surface, tracing the nearly imperceptible lines that marked where new stone had been fitted to old, where the original structure had been disrupted and subsequently reconstructed. "Inspector," he called out, addressing Graves, who stood near the entrance with the constable who bore the lantern, "I should very much like you to inquire whether anyone in the village possesses recollection of any significant incident occurring beneath this location, a collapse, perhaps, or a structural failure that would have necessitated immediate remediation. And I should like to know whether the Reverend Blackwell was serving as vicar 30 years ago, or whether his predecessor might be available for consultation." It was as Graves departed upon this errand that Whimsy noticed something that appeared to have escaped the attention of Mr. Ashford's careful modifications, a narrow space between two sections of flooring where the grouting had failed to achieve perfect compression, leaving a gap no wider than the thickness of a letter. He employed his penknife to extract a small quantity of the material that had accumulated within this space, discovering to his considerable interest what appeared to be fragments of fabric, not merely ordinary fabric, but material that bore the remnants of embroidery, the sort of ecclesiastical vestment that might be worn by a member of the clergy during formal services. The color was faded to a dull gray-brown, but beneath the accumulated grime, one could still perceive traces of what had once been gold thread, worked into patterns that suggested considerable craftsmanship. Whimsy examined this discovery with the care of a paleontologist studying the fossilized remains of an extinct creature, his mind racing through the implications of what the presence of such material might suggest. The Revenant returned within the hour bearing news that seemed to confirm the trajectory of Whimsy's reasoning. The Reverend Blackwell had indeed been serving as vicar 30 years prior, though he appeared considerably less inclined to discuss the matter than might have been hoped. However, the constable had made inquiries among the older residents of the village and had discovered references to an incident so distant and so thoroughly suppressed that it had been nearly expunged from collective memory, the disappearance of a young girl, the daughter of the church organist, some 30 years prior. She had been missing for approximately 3 months before her body was discovered, where precisely the constable's informant had become unaccountably vague, and the incident had been officially closed within weeks, with remarkably little publicity or investigation. The girl's name had been Margaret Hartley, and she had been 12 years old at the time of her death. Whimsy felt a particular chill traverse his spine at this revelation, the sort of cold that suggests one has perceived the outline of a crime whose magnitude transcends the immediate circumstances of a single death and extends backward across decades of silence and complicity. Margaret Hartley. The surname was not, he reflected, uncommon, but the coincidence seemed unlikely to be coincidental. He returned directly to Ashford House and requested an interview with Miss Eleanor Hartley, who appeared at his summons with the same rigid propriety that had characterized her previous encounter. "Miss Hartley," he said, his tone gentle but carrying the weight of inexorable purpose, "I wonder if you might inform me regarding a family connection to a Margaret Hartley, who disappeared from this village some 30 years ago. I should like to know whether this individual was a relation of yours, and if so, what circumstances surrounded her death and the investigation, or lack thereof, that followed its discovery." The housekeeper's face underwent a transformation so profound that Whimsy feared for a moment she might suffer a cardiac episode herself. Her hands trembled, and her voice, when she finally spoke, emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Margaret was my sister," she said. "She was only a child. What the village chose to forget, and what Mr. Ashford chose to conceal, was that she did not simply die of accident or misadventure. She was murdered, Lord Peter, murdered, and her body hidden within the very foundation of the church he spent 30 years trying to restore. And the man who killed her, the man who concealed her body, and who has been protected by silence and ecclesiastical privilege all these years, was the Reverend Blackwell himself." The revelation hung in the air of the study like a particularly noxious miasma, its presence rendering every previously established assumption regarding motive, guilt, and complicity subject to fundamental re-examination. Whimsy permitted Miss Hartley a moment to compose herself, recognizing that what he had just extracted from her represented not merely the culmination of 30 years of suppressed grief, but the confrontation with a truth that her professional obligations and her position within the household had required her to conceal with every ounce of her considerable fortitude. When she resumed speaking, her voice had assumed a quality of terrible clarity, as though the act of articulation had somehow liberated her from the burden of discretion that had constrained her for 3 decades. "He came to us," she said slowly, "perhaps a year after Margaret's death. He was young then, no more than 25 years old, a scholar of considerable accomplishment who had been studying at Oxford. He called himself Dr. Thomas Ashford. He took his doctorate in classical languages and philosophy, and he took rooms in the village because he claimed to be conducting research regarding the architectural history of the parish church. Mr. Raymond Ashford, who was considerably older and who possessed considerable financial means, took him under his patronage. They became intimate friends, engaged in long discussions regarding philosophy and ecclesiastical matters. What neither of them knew, what I ensured that neither of them would discover, was that I had deduced the truth regarding my sister's death long before this Dr. Ashford appeared in our village." Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle shift, the merest recalibration of his features, suggesting that the narrative had taken a turn considerably more complex than his preliminary deductions had suggested. "You are stating," he said carefully, "that you possessed knowledge of the Reverend Blackwell's culpability in your sister's death, and that you maintained this knowledge in silence for a period of approximately 29 years. Might I inquire what circumstances prevented you from bringing this matter to the attention of the constabulary at that time?" Miss Hartley's laugh was a brief, bitter sound, entirely devoid of humor or warmth. "The constabulary," she repeated. "The local constable was, and remains, a man of extremely limited intellectual capacity and even more limited willingness to entertain the notion that a man of the cloth might be capable of committing such an offense. Moreover, the Reverend Blackwell possessed considerable influence within this village and within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. My father, who was the church organist, was dependent upon his goodwill for his livelihood. When I attempted to bring my suspicions to the attention of the vicar's superior, the bishop himself, I was informed in no uncertain terms that such accusations without concrete evidence constituted a grave calumny against a member of the clergy, and that I would be well advised to abandon such claims entirely, lest I find myself subject to legal action for defamation. I was 18 years old, an orphan save for my father, entirely dependent upon my position as a domestic servant. I chose silence. And when Dr. Ashford arrived in the village, Whimsy continued, his tone suggesting that he was now beginning to perceive the architecture of a conspiracy far more elaborate than simple murder, you recognized in him a man of sufficient intellectual capability and sufficient moral conviction. Oh, potentially accomplish what you could not. You cultivated his acquaintance. You provided him with information. You guided him toward the truth regarding your sister's death. Miss Hartley nodded slowly, her expression suggesting neither remorse nor satisfaction, but rather the grim acknowledgement of a course of action that had consumed the better part of her adult existence. I learned his history, she said. His mother had been a victim of clerical abuse, not of the sort you might imagine, but of a more subtle and perhaps more insidious form. A vicar in the parish where she resided had seduced her when she was scarcely more than a girl, had promised her marriage and respectability, and had subsequently abandoned her when her pregnancy became apparent. She died giving birth to Thomas, and he was raised by relatives consumed with bitterness regarding the ecclesiastical establishment and its capacity to protect predators beneath the robes of sanctity. He became a scholar of symbolic theology and cryptography precisely because he sought to understand the hidden systems through which institutional corruption perpetuated itself across generations. When I finally revealed to him what I knew regarding Margaret's death, and when I showed him the embroidered vestment fragment I had retained, the vestment the Reverend Blackwell had been wearing the night of my sister's disappearance, he understood immediately that he had been called to accomplish a work of moral reckoning, and the mysterious visits, Whimsy said, the fortnightly encounters conducted through the garden entrance, the heated discussions that Miss Hartley observed. These constituted a process of persuasion? Dr. Ashford, attempting to convince his patron to acknowledge the crime and accept legal responsibility? Miss Hartley's expression hardened into something approximating contempt. Mr. Ashford was weak, she said. I.D. flatly. He had spent 30 years engaged in a form of moral penance, the donations to the church restoration, the financial support, the desperate attempt to consecrate through architecture what had been desecrated through murder. But he lacked the moral courage to confront what he had known and concealed. Dr. Ashford demanded that he come forward, that he provide testimony regarding what he had witnessed on the night Margaret disappeared, that he acknowledge his complicity in the cover-up. Mr. Ashford refused. He insisted that such a revelation would destroy the reputation of the church itself, would render invalid all the good he had accomplished through his restoration efforts. On the final evening, when Dr. Ashford arrived with the explicit demand that Mr. Ashford present himself to the authorities by the following morning, or face the consequences of continued silence, Mr. Ashford made his final refusal. And Dr. Ashford, in that moment, determined that the time for persuasion had passed and the time for judgment had arrived. "Tell me precisely how it was accomplished," Whimsy said quietly. "The locked study, the body positioned with such theatrical precision, the symbolic arrangement of objects that would communicate his meaning to those who possessed the capacity to understand it." Miss Hartley drew a breath that seemed to consume the last reserves of her emotional strength. He poisoned the evening brandy that Mr. Ashford habitually consumed before retiring to his study. A substance derived from certain fungi, something that would produce the appearance of cardiac failure while leaving no evidence of toxins in the bloodstream. He remained in the study for some hours, watching as Mr. Ashford deteriorated, ensuring that death occurred precisely as intended. And then he arranged the objects, the fountain pen, the ecclesiastical seal, the bisected gooseberries, One. A symbol of the mathematical language through which Mr. Ashford himself had studied the hidden truths of creation, now perverted into a confession and an indictment. The mathematical symbols spelled out in the esoteric notation that Mr. Ashford himself had studied, a single word, judgment. Whimsy remained motionless for a considerable interval following this revelation, his expression suggesting that he was engaged in the process of reconciling the theoretical framework of his deductions with the practical reality of what Miss Hartley had just articulated. When he finally spoke, his voice possessed a quality of peculiar restraint, as though the full magnitude of what had transpired, the elaborate moral calculus that had culminated in murder, the decades of concealment and psychological torment, the collision between justice and vengeance, had imposed upon him an obligation to proceed with extreme circumspection. "Miss Hartley," he said at length, "you have confessed to me not merely the means by which Mr. Ashford was murdered, but also your own complicity in the crime itself. You have been an accessory before and after the fact, having provided Dr. Ashford with the information necessary to locate and identify his target, having counseled him regarding the nature of the victim's psychology and vulnerabilities, and having maintained silence in the immediate aftermath of the murder when you possessed knowledge that might have facilitated his apprehension. I wonder if you have considered the legal consequences of such confession, or whether you anticipated that such consequences were inevitable from the moment you undertook to place in motion the machinery of retribution." Miss Hartley met his gaze with an expression of complete composure, as though she had been rehearsing this confrontation for the entirety of her 30-year vigil. "I have considered nothing, LSE, she said quietly. "I knew that to speak the truth regarding Margaret's death would inevitably require me to acknowledge my own role in bringing about Mr. Ashford's demise. I also knew that without such acknowledgement, the truth would remain buried with my sister, and the Reverend Blackwell would continue to walk freely through this village, conducting services and offering benedictions, while the weight of his crime remained concealed beneath ecclesiastical authority and institutional silence. I chose knowing that the choice would cost me everything. At that precise moment, as though responding to some unspoken signal that only he could perceive, Bunter appeared at the study threshold with news that seemed to cascade through the room like a physical force. The Reverend Blackwell had attempted to flee the village approximately 2 hours prior, having apparently learned through some mechanism of village gossip that the investigation into Mr. Ashford's death had begun to touch upon matters that extended far beyond a simple cardiac episode. He had been intercepted at the railway station in the adjacent town of Guildford by Inspector Graves and a constable, apprehended while in the act of purchasing a ticket to London under an assumed name. More significantly, he had been discovered in possession of documentation, letters, diary entries, architectural sketches, that provided irrefutable evidence not merely of his knowledge of Margaret Hartley's death, but of his direct responsibility for that death and his subsequent conspiracy to conceal the crime. The letters, which had been preserved by the Reverend Blackwell himself in a manner suggesting the particular pathology of individuals who simultaneously seek to conceal their crimes while documenting them for posterity, detailed with horrifying specificity the circumstances of Margaret's death and the mechanism through which her body had been secreted within the church foundations. Whimsy received this intelligence with a nod that suggested he had anticipated precisely such a development, and he turned once more to address Miss Hartley with an expression of complex sympathy mingled with profound moral clarity. "Inspector Graves will be arriving shortly to take you into custody," he said, his tone carrying no trace of accusation or condemnation, but rather the resigned recognition of an individual who understood that the pursuit of justice, however justified in its ultimate aim, invariably produced casualties among those who sought to accomplish it. "I wonder if you would permit me to ask one final question before that occurs. When Dr. Ashford departed from this house on the evening following Mr. Ashford's death, did you know with absolute certainty that he had accomplished what he had come to do, or did you maintain some residual hope that he might have experienced a change of conscience and that Mr. Ashford might yet have been persuaded to come forward voluntarily?" Miss Hartley's response came after a prolonged silence, during which she appeared to be examining some internal landscape visible only to herself. "I knew," she said finally. I knew the moment I observed his expression as he departed. There was a peculiar quality to his countenance, not satisfaction precisely, but rather the expression of an individual who has completed a work that he understood to be simultaneously essential and damnable. He did not speak to me. He did not require my assistance in departing through the garden entrance. He simply left, and I heard the gate close behind him, and I knew that Mr. Raymond Ashford was dead and that the process of judgment had been initiated. What I did not anticipate was the manner in which my own judgment would swiftly follow, or the recognition that in choosing to become an instrument of retribution, I had simultaneously become an instrument of my own destruction. As though summoned by the inevitability of narrative progression, Inspector Graves appeared at that moment, accompanied by 2 constables bearing the grim apparatus of official custody. Whimsy rose from his chair and stepped aside, permitting the officers to conduct their work with the mechanical precision that such procedures demanded. It was as Miss Hartley was being led from the study that she paused at the threshold and turned to address Whimsy directly. "You have solved the mystery," she said, her voice carrying an odd quality of finality, "but you have not yet understood the true nature of what has occurred in this village. Mr. Ashford's murder was merely the final act in a drama that began 30 years ago, when a child was murdered, and her death was permitted to be forgotten. The real crime was not what occurred last evening, Lord Peter, but what occurred in those months when Margaret lay hidden and no one, not the constable, not the bishop, not the village itself, possessed sufficient moral courage to demand the truth. Mr. Ashford, for all his weakness and his complicity in that original silence, was ultimately merely another victim of the same institutional corruption that claimed Margaret's life. We have all been victims, every one of us, of a system designed to protect the guilty and silence the innocent. The evening had assumed that particular quality of darkness which comes only in late September, when the transition from summer to autumn has rendered the natural world somewhat alien to those accustomed to the more generous illumination of preceding months. Whimsy stood alone in the study of Raymond Ashford, having dispatched both Bunter and Inspector Graves upon various errands of a bureaucratic nature, and found himself contemplating the remarkable architecture of a crime whose ultimate resolution seemed to shift in moral character with each successive revelation. The objects remained upon the desk precisely where they had been discovered: the fountain pen, the ecclesiastical seal, the bisected gooseberry, their symbolic significance now rendered almost banal through the application of rational analysis, transformed from cryptic pronouncements into mere tokens of a message that had been comprehended and disseminated throughout the entire investigative apparatus. Yet something continued to trouble him, a persistent dissonance between the elegance of the solution and the ugliness of the human emotions that had rendered such elegant machinery necessary. He withdrew from his jacket pocket the fragment of embroidered vestment that Bunter had recovered from beneath the chancel flooring, examining it in the lamplight with the concentration of a scholar studying a particularly recalcitrant text. The needlework was exquisite, each stitch executed with the precision of someone possessed of considerable manual skill and perhaps considerable patience. The sort of patient artistry that suggested the vestment had been created not through commercial manufacture, but through the dedicated labor of an individual for whom such creation constituted a form of devotion or meditation. It was at that moment that a realization of considerable significance struck him with the force of a physical blow, a realization that seemed to reorganize his entire understanding of the crime, and to suggest that the narrative which had emerged through the course of his investigation, while not precisely false, represented at best an incomplete accounting of the true complexity of what had occurred. He rose from his chair and moved swiftly through the corridors of Ashford House toward the servants' quarters, arriving at Miss Hartley's chamber with a purposefulness that suggested he had perceived something requiring immediate clarification. The room was sparse, almost monastic in its simplicity. A narrow bed, a simple wardrobe, a small writing desk bearing a few volumes of religious instruction, and a leather-bound journal. It was the journal that captured Whimsy's attention, and he opened it to discover entries spanning the entire 30-year period during which Miss Hartley had maintained her silence. The handwriting, while disciplined, grew progressively more erratic as the entries advanced chronologically, suggesting an individual engaged in a form of psychological self-documentation that had gradually devolved into something approximating obsessive repetition. One passage, dated some 5 years prior, struck him with particular force. I have begun to question whether the pursuit of justice through Dr. Ashford has become merely another form of the crime itself. In seeking to make Mr. Ashford pay for his complicity in Margaret's concealment, am I not guilty of the same sin that I have spent 30 years condemning, the sin of deciding that another's life is a proper instrument for the accomplishment of moral aims? If Margaret's death was wrong, then surely my engineering of Mr. Ashford's death is equally wrong, regardless of how eloquently I might justify it through appeals to retribution and ecclesiastical corruption. Wimsey descended the stairs with considerably less haste than he had ascended them, his mind now engaged in the process of reconstructing the entire narrative with this new piece of information integrated into its structure. He found Inspector Graves in the drawing-room, engaged in the tedious documentation that characterized the concluding stages of criminal investigation, and he seated himself across from that officer with the air of a man prepared to revise several fundamental aspects of their shared understanding. "Inspector," he said without preamble, "I wonder if you have made inquiries regarding Dr. Thomas Ashford's current location, and whether you have determined with certainty that he remains in the village, or whether he has in fact departed and is even now engaged in the process of removing himself from the jurisdiction entirely." Graves consulted his notes with the methodical care that had come to characterize his approach to the investigation. "He has not been apprehended as yet, my lord. We have no firm evidence as to his present whereabouts, though we have circulated his description to the railway authorities and the various constabularies in neighboring counties. We had assumed he would attempt to flee, but thus far no credible sightings have been reported." Wimsey rose and moved toward the window, gazing out into the darkness with an expression suggesting he was observing something visible only to himself. "I wonder," he said slowly, "whether Dr. Ashford has fled at all, or whether he has instead positioned himself in a location where he might observe the consequences of his actions without subjecting himself to the immediate risk of apprehension. Consider, Inspector, a man of his intellectual capacity, possessed of 30 years of experience studying the hidden systems through which institutional corruption perpetuates itself, would surely have anticipated that his elaborate tableau would ultimately lead to investigation and discovery. He would have understood that Miss Hartley's confession was not merely a possibility, but an inevitability, and he would have prepared contingencies accordingly. You are suggesting, my lord, that Dr. Ashford anticipated his own apprehension and positioned himself to observe it." Graves's tone suggested that he found this hypothesis considerably less persuasive than the simpler assumption that the murderer had simply fled like any company. "Memon criminal. I am suggesting something considerably more complex than that, Inspector. I am suggesting that Dr. Ashford has been engaged in a form of theatrical performance the entire time. That the murder of Mr. Ashford, while genuine in its lethal consequence, was intended, not merely as an act of vengeance, but as a demonstration, a final argument rendered in the symbolic vocabulary he had spent his life studying. The mathematical symbols, the ecclesiastical seal, the bisected gooseberries, these were never intended primarily for us, the investigators. They were intended for the village itself, for the community that had conspired in silence to permit Margaret Hartley's death to be forgotten. And the true culmination of this elaborate performance will not be Dr. Ashford's capture or his flight, but rather the confrontation that must inevitably occur when we finally locate him, and he is compelled to justify his actions to those whose moral complicity he has sought to expose through the mechanism of murder." Wimsey turned from the window to face the inspector directly, his expression now containing something darker than mere intellectual satisfaction, a recognition of the manner in which the pursuit of abstract justice had produced concrete human devastation. "I believe, Inspector, that we shall find Dr. Ashford in the parish church itself, almost certainly in the vicinity of the chancel where Margaret's remains were concealed. He will be waiting there not as a fugitive, but as a witness to the consequences of the crime he has committed, a witness to the manner in which this village must finally confront the truth it has spent 30 years avoiding, The parish church of St. Cuthbert's seemed to have assumed an almost sentient quality in the dead hours preceding midnight, its ancient stone appearing to absorb and radiate the accumulated weight of centuries of prayer, confession, and concealment. Whimsy entered through the main portal accompanied by Inspector Graves and 2 constables bearing electric torches, though he proceeded with a deliberation that suggested he was neither hunting nor hurrying, but rather approaching an appointment that had been scheduled with considerable precision. The interior of the church was rendered somewhat disorienting by the interplay of lamplight and shadow, the Norman pillars casting elongated silhouettes across the floor and creating the visual impression of a forest of dark sentinels observing the intrusion of the living into a space that had gradually come to feel more tomb than sanctuary. It was Whimsy who perceived the figure first, a man seated in the front pew immediately adjacent to the chancel, motionless and apparently absorbed in contemplation of the altar. Dr. Thomas Ashford bore little resemblance to the mysterious visitor whom Miss Hartley had described. He was older than Whimsy had anticipated, his features marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from having sustained intellectual and emotional intensity beyond the ordinary bounds of human resilience. When he became aware of their presence, he did not rise or attempt to flee, but rather turned to regard them with an expression of complete calm, as though he had been awaiting their arrival with the certainty of one who understands that all outcomes are predetermined and equally acceptable. "Dr. Ashford," Whimsy said, his tone remarkably gentle considering the gravity of the circumstances, "you have waited for us here. I confess myself somewhat impressed by your capacity for resignation, or perhaps it would be more accurate to describe it as your capacity for accepting the inevitable consequences of your actions. Most individuals, when confronted with the likelihood of apprehension for murder, experience at least a momentary impulse toward flight or concealment. You, however, have chosen to remain in this sanctuary, in the immediate vicinity of the location where your act of vengeance originated. I wonder if you might explain this apparent contradiction." Dr. Ashford rose slowly from the pew, and Whimsy observed that his movements possessed none of the agitation one might expect from an individual confronted with arrest. "I remained because the work is not yet complete," he said, his voice carrying the quality of someone who has moved beyond the ordinary emotional responses that constrain ordinary individuals. The murder of Raymond Ashford was merely the initial chapter in what must be a considerably longer narrative. The Reverend Blackwell remains imprisoned within the boundaries of his own consciousness, protected by decades of ecclesiastical authority and village complicity. The constable remains ignorant of the true nature of the crime he was called upon to investigate. The bishop remains secure in his conviction that the reputation of the church supersedes the justice owed to a murdered child, and the village remains in its comfortable darkness, unwilling to confront the manner in which it has been complicit in the perpetuation of evil. I have remained in this church to ensure that none of these comfortable illusions can be maintained any longer." Whimsy gestured to the constables to remain at a distance, and he moved closer to Dr. Ashford with the caution of a man approaching something that might explode or collapse without warning. "Tell me," he said, "what specifically you intended to accomplish through this elaborate tableau, the symbolic objects, the cryptographic message, the theatrical staging of Mr. Ashford's death. Surely you understood that such elaboration would inevitably lead to investigation, and that investigation would eventually expose not merely the mechanism, the crime, but your own role in its commission. Did you not anticipate that Miss Hartley would eventually confess her complicity?" Dr. Ashford's expression underwent a subtle transformation, suggesting that he had been waiting for precisely this question. "I anticipated that Miss Hartley would be destroyed by the knowledge of what she had set in motion," he said quietly. "I anticipated that the pursuit of justice would consume her as thoroughly as Margaret's death consumed my childhood and my capacity for normal human attachment. I anticipated that she would eventually seek expiation through confession, and that confession would lead to an investigation that would force this village to confront what it had chosen to forget. What I did not anticipate, Lord Peter, was that you would arrive to conduct that investigation with sufficient clarity of vision to perceive the moral complexity of what had occurred. Most investigators would have sought merely to establish guilt and punishment. You have sought to understand the mechanism through which guilt and innocence become indistinguishable when viewed through the lens of institutional corruption and moral cowardice. And what do you propose now? Wimsey inquired, though his tone suggested he already possessed some understanding of the answer. The Reverend Blackwell has been apprehended. Miss Hartley has been taken into custody. The architectural evidence regarding Margaret's concealment has been recovered. The documents you possessed detailing the circumstances of her death are now in the possession of the authorities. What remains to be accomplished? Dr. Ashford moved toward the chancel steps, and Wimsey followed at a respectful distance. When he reached the precise location where the flooring had been modified to conceal Margaret's remains, he knelt with the deliberation of someone engaged in an act of religious signif. "Icons." "What remains," he said, his voice now barely more than a whisper, "is the acknowledgement that no amount of punishment, no quantity of legal process, no volume of ecclesiastical discipline will restore what was lost. Margaret Hartley was 12 years old when she was murdered. She had her entire life ahead of her, all the loves and losses, all the accomplishments and failures, all the small moments of human connection that constitute existence. That future was stolen from her, and it cannot be restored. What I have done to Raymond Ashford and to this village is not justice, Lord Peter. It is merely the articulation of a grief so profound that it has consumed everything it has touched, including myself." Wimsey stood in silence for a considerable period, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he had arrived at some conclusion of considerable personal significance. "Inspector Graves," he said, without shifting his gaze from Dr. Ashford, "you will take Dr. Ashford into custody and transport him to the constabulary for formal booking. However, I would suggest that before you do so, you permit him to make a statement regarding the circumstances of Margaret Hartley's death, a statement that will be recorded and preserved, and that will be transmitted to every relevant authority, ecclesiastical and civil, in this jurisdiction. Let it be known that Margaret Hartley's death was not an accident, and that it was not forgotten by everyone. Let it be known that her death was witnessed, remembered, and ultimately avenged, however imperfectly such vengeance might be accomplished. And let the village understand that silence is never truly silence, that concealment invariably metastasizes into something far more dangerous than the truth it seeks to suppress." As the constables moved forward to secure Dr. Ashford, Wimsey turned toward the exit, his silhouette briefly framed against the chancel's dim illumination before he disappeared into the darkness beyond, leaving behind him only the certainty that some crimes could never be adequately punished, and that the pursuit of justice often produced victims indistinguishable from the guilty.